The practice of seizing enemy ships and pressing them into service is fairly well known. It was a very common tactic in the Age of Sail. The Royal Navy had several legacy names that only make sense when you realize they originated from captured ships. However, aside from prize ships, it became much less common in the 20th century. Ships were simply captured less often. Most were sunk outright, or too badly damaged to bother salvaging after a battle. As a result, those ships that were captured and pressed into service generally came from port captures. One such example, and the topic of this video, is USS Stewart. This destroyer is probably known for one thing, and one thing only, being captured mostly intact by the Japanese and pressed into their service. Not that she got up too much in that time, but it's still a fairly special situation. Let's look at her story now. The ship that would become USS Stewart was laid down on September 9th, 1919. One of many, many four-stacker destroyers built around that time. In Stewart's case, she was part of the Clemson class. These were fairly large and capable ships for their day, and would see quite a long service career, mostly because so many were made that the United States Navy could run them ragged and still have spares floating in reserve. The Wicks and Clemson class ships would be the backbone of the interwar destroyer force. On a displacement of 1,200 or so tons, Stewart carried the standard loadout of 4 4-inch 102mm guns, supported by a single 3-inch anti-aircraft gun and a smattering of machine guns. That said, as a destroyer, the main offensive punch came from the 12 21-inch torpedo tubes. These were carried in 4 triple mounts, with 2 on either side of the ship, in a fairly distinctive staggered layout starting around the 4th funnel. When it came to speed, that was around 35 knots, generated by 4 boilers, providing around 25,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts. With that covered, back to Stewart's story. The destroyer launched on March 4th, 1920, in Philadelphia. The fitting out process was fairly typical, all told, with the destroyer commissioned into the Navy on September 15th, 1920. What sets Stewart apart from her many sister ships is that she didn't immediately go into storage. While Stewart's first year of service was with a reserve division, this was primarily coastal training. The ship was still active in comparison to a lot of other four-stackers. And in October 1921, Stewart shifted to full service with the Atlantic Fleet. That would see her participate in various fleet exercises from the East Coast to the Caribbean. Nothing particularly exciting for the time, although it would only last until April of 1922. Because, after a short refit, the destroyer left the Atlantic on June 20th, 1922. Stewart sailed through the Mediterranean and then the Indian Ocean on her way to the Philippines. She had been reassigned to the Asiatic Fleet and would spend the rest of her time under the American flag in that fleet. By no means was she unique in this, as the Asiatic Fleet picked up quite a few four-stackers of both Wicks and Clemson class. For the remainder of the 1920s, Stewart did the traditional Asiatic Fleet mission, sailing on port visits, particularly to China, during the summer, before returning to Manila in the winter months. These various visits were broken up, in turn, by training exercises. That was a calm routine for the most part. However, there are always exceptions to this rule. For example, in the period between 1924 and 1928, things in China got interesting. Not quite to the point of war, although that would come later. But anti-foreign unrests began to really pick up, especially in the coastal regions. This was not surprising. It was, however, a break in the routine. Stewart would spend a good chunk of time in China in response to this, first carrying Marines to Shanghai in January of 1925, then supporting the gunboats on the river patrol. Stewart was even in China for the Nanking incident on March 24, 1927. She was also involved in a collision with a merchant ship on November 5th of 1927 that dented her side. As the decade ended and the 1930s began, things would only get more chaotic in China. Stewart was present when the Japanese attacked Shanghai in January 1932. Another collision followed on March 23rd of the same year. That time, Stewart ran into the British sloop HMS Sandwich and a couple of barges. This ended with an anchor chain wrapped around her port propeller, damaging it enough to require repairs. Yet another collision happened in July of 1934 when Stewart dragged her anchor and hit a Chinese warship. This did only minor damage, but was not exactly a ringing endorsement of her luck. And the ship would be in China again when full-scale war broke out in 1937. In fact, for much of the early war between China and Japan, Stewart was in Chinese waters. Her crew probably saw a fair bit of the consequences of that war, including bombs landing nearby while she was in Shanghai on October 1st, 1937. However, after war in Europe broke out in September 1939, Stewart was pulled out of China. She returned to the Philippines for patrol duty at that point. For most of 1940, that was where Stewart remained, the only exception to the rule being a final visit to China from July 7th to September 23rd of 1940. That was her last time in Chinese waters, as relations between Japan and the United States began to worsen even more. By 1941, Stewart and the rest of the Asiatic fleet was on high alert, ultimately culminating on November 27th in an order being sent out. The major surface combatants of the fleet would move south to the Dutch East Indies. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Stewart was based in Borneo. This was December 8th, 1941, on that side of the international dateline. For the rest of December, Stewart spent her time escorting various auxiliaries from the Philippines to Australia. This was important work, as the Japanese began to launch air raids on Manila and other American bases. And it was what Stewart continued doing, albeit with a change of route, when 1942 came around. In January of that year, the destroyer shifted to escorting convoys in the East Indies. The Japanese advance had moved further south every day, as both land and naval forces struggled to hold them back. The situation would deteriorate from there. On February 4th, Stewart was escorting the cruiser USS Marblehead on an attempt to intercept the Japanese. This saw the two ships, designed to serve together, sail towards the Battle of the Makassar Strait. Unfortunately for Stewart, her 3-inch gun and whatever machine guns her crew had stuffed aboard proved completely inadequate. Japanese air attack descended upon Marblehead, and there was little Stewart could do about that. The cruiser was battered and forced to withdraw. Stewart escorted her back to Java before Marblehead left the theater on her own legendary voyage home. For her part, Stewart remained in the Indies. She would participate in a failed attempt to contest Japanese landings on Sumatra on February 14th. This saw a near collision with a Dutch destroyer that had managed to run aground ahead of Stewart. The next day, February 15th, saw Japanese air attacks that forced the Allied formation to turn for home. Through all of this, Stewart had so far avoided damage. Unfortunately for her, that luck was soon to run out. The Japanese landed on the island of Bali on February 19th. The Dutch Admiral Doorman sent his forces against those landings, in 3 different groups on the night of the 19th and into the early hours of the 20th. Stewart was the lead ship in the second group, which exposed her to withering fire from Japanese destroyers. Those shot up her boats, damaged her torpedo tubes and galley, and finally landed a crippling hit beneath the waterline. That last shot opened Stewart's seams and flooded her steering engine room. Her crew were nothing if not tenacious, though, and managed to keep their destroyer going. Stewart maintained her position in the Allied formation. Her crew continued to run the steering engine under 2 feet of water that had flooded the room. The damage was too severe to sail on for long, however. Stewart was put in the floating dry dock at Surabaya on February 22nd for desperately needed repairs. This almost immediately went wrong as the destroyer wasn't properly supported in the dock. As it rose up, Stewart fell off the keel blocks and onto her side in 12 feet of water. This bent her prop shafts and damaged her hull. At this point, with no way to refloat her, and the port at real risk of falling to the Japanese, Stewart was abandoned. Her crew left by that afternoon, while the dock workers were placed in charge of scuttling the ship. In their defense, they did the job. Stewart had demolition charges set off inside her hull, in addition to a Japanese bomb hitting her amidships. And on March 2nd, 1942, the dry dock itself was scuttled as the port was evacuated. Stewart's story probably should have ended there, with the Japanese scrapping her hulk at best. Certainly the Navy thought so, as Stewart was stricken and her name assigned to a destroyer escort. That ship, USS Stewart DD-224, survives to this day as a museum ship in Galveston, Texas. As for the destroyer, her story didn't end in scrapping, because late in the war, pilots began to report a curious sight: a clearly recognizable four-stacker operating in enemy waters, well behind what served as a front line in the Pacific War. As if that wasn't weird enough, the pilots also noted the forward two stacks being trunked together, in typical Japanese style. Even with that change, and flying the Japanese flag, the lines of a four-stacker were unmistakable. As it turned out, the Japanese raised Stewart from the bottom of Surabaya's harbor in February of 1943. More specifically, they raised the dry dock she was still stuck in. At that point, one Lieutenant Fukui Shizuo set about repairing the wrecked old destroyer. Regardless of the cost of this move, the Japanese commissioned the ex-Stewart as patrol boat number 102. The ship was refit with two 3-inch guns, initially Dutch leftovers but later replaced with Japanese models, as well as other assorted weaponry from machine guns to depth charges. The ship was, however, only capable of 26 knots due to lingering issues. In this new guise, PB-102, as it's often shortened, served with the Southwest Area Fleet on escort duty, about the same as she had done while Stewart. She would drop depth charges on a suspected submarine on her first Japanese voyage, and then on March 4th, 1944, the ship was hit by a dud torpedo. On March 22nd, she avoided 2 more submarine torpedoes. Clearly, the USN was not happy. That said, the only notable action the ship participated in was the sinking of USS Harder on August 24th, and that's only because she was sailing with the ship, CD-22, that actually sank Harder. PB-102, to my knowledge, had no direct involvement. By November of 1944, the ship was in dire need of an overhaul and was sent to Kure. She arrived there and had her Dutch weaponry swapped out with Japanese models, including the 25mm morale boosters. The destroyer also gained a tripod foremast before setting out once more. She would also, in a later refit, gain some radar. With the reconquest of the Philippines, however, PB-102 was instead transferred to Korea, where the ship would be bombed by American aircraft on April 28, 1945. An alternate version of events has the ship attacked by PBY Catalinas on April 27th while escorting a convoy. Either way, PB-102 was sent back to Kure for further repair work. She would still be there when Japan surrendered, and curious American occupation forces found her sitting in harbor, rat-infested and in terrible shape. While the ship was thoroughly worn out and outdated, the Navy still went through with reclaiming the ex-Stewart. On October 29, 1945, she was recommissioned back into the United States Navy. However, with the new USS Stewart in active service, she was simply named DD-224, often called RAMP-224 for Recovered Allied Military Personnel. Never underestimate the fondness sailors have for their ships. In any event, DD-224's engines broke down on the way home near Guam. She would be towed the rest of the way, arriving in San Francisco in March 1946. Struck from the Navy list once more on April 17th, the worn-out old destroyer was decommissioned on May 23, 1946. The next day, May 24th, she was expended as a target for aircraft, bringing an end to a long and interesting career. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.